Presenting now are Joseph Kunnuji and Matildie Wium. Joseph Kunnuji is a senior lecturer in African music at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa. His doctoral research examined Ogu music as a marginalized practice in Lagos. His recent projects continue to explore lesser-known African musical practices. He is an associate editor with the Journal of the Musical Arts in Africa and has published in the Yearbook for Traditional Music and Popular Music and Society, among others. Matildie Wium is an associate professor in the Odeon School of Music at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa. She has published on 20th century South African art music, the musical practices and experiences of female opera singers in the mid-19th century London, and has collaborated with Joseph Kunnuji on analysis of melodic conventions of the Ogu people in Lagos. During 2021 to 2024, she co-edited the journal SAMUS, South African Music Studies. They will be presenting Alo as an improvisational art, analyzing the artistry of Yorùbá storytelling through a collaborative close listening approach to Gerhard Kubik's archived Alo.
This contribution we are to 1963 a well-known Yorùbá law called Ayorinde from the collection of the Austrian ethnomusicologist Gerhard Kubik, aiming to demonstrate how the two versions of the story construct their text from a shared corpus of materials. Yet, that is, shared plot, narrative structure, characters, and the same call and response song, yet lead to two different morals. Our argument animates and expands Karen Barber's seminal publications on the position of text, which for her is not necessarily written down, in the performance of African oral literature. By applying the notion of entextualization to African oral literatures, Barber questioned the binary divisions between text and performance, showing how constituting text as object-like is the condition of possibility of poetics of fluidity. With this, she suggests that the performance of African oral literature does not simply emerge impulsively, but is based on a repository of materials that need to be elaborated to achieve their goal. While Barber has shown that, quote, it is the very consolidation of chunks of examinable, quotable, repeatable text which makes possible the dynamic process of fluid incorporation, reinflection, and recycling, unquote, in these art forms. We bring into focus how such chunks of text are consolidated in the case of Alo. In particular, our analysis shows that a specific Alo story may exist in different versions known to various individuals and communities, retaining the same materials and motifs, but diverging in emphasis and moral. In this way, our analysis demonstrates that performances of the same text do not simply diverge because performance is context sensitive and depends on the artistry of the performer, but that they also diverge because the shared corpus of materials has wide-ranging potential for recombination and may have coalesced into different versions of the same story. In a further contribution, we show that the processes of entextualization that Barber described convincingly for a high poetic genre like Oriki also feature in the art form of Alo, which is perhaps not traditionally regarded as possessing the same aesthetic sophistication of Oriki, Ijala, and Eseifa, that is, Ifa divinations.
The study of African oral literatures has already amassed a sizable body of scholarship. Ruth Finnegan, Isidore Okpewo, and Godini Dara have contributed useful continental overviews, focusing on various features of these art forms, including their performance, social functions, formulations, and modes of transmission, While all of these authors emphasize the variability of African oral art forms, which hangs together with the realization of materials in performance, Barber's work on intextualization brings, in our view, a crucial perspective from which to reinterrogate the artistry and provenances of Alo storytelling. In her words, when practitioners of African oral traditions perform, it is a performance of something. Something identifiable is understood to have pre-existed the moment of utterance, or alternatively, something is understood to be constituted in utterance, which can be abstracted or detached from the immediate context and re-embodied in a future performance. Even if the only place this something can be held to exist is in people's minds or memories, still, it is surely distinguishable from immediate and immediately disappearing actual utterance. Regarding Yoruba oral traditions specifically, Dara has emphasized the richness of existing research, positing that, quote, every major genre of Yoruba oral tradition has been extensively investigated, close quote, a claim which we suggest requires closer interrogation given the paucity of literature on the performance of Aloha Pagbe. Existing studies seem to us to focus on the didactic role of Alo in the socialization process, being situated in fields such as anthropology, linguistics, and education, while the publications of the Austrian ethnomusicologist Gerhard Kubik, whose fieldwork recordings we use for this paper, tended to focus on the musical characteristics of the songs included in these tales. Yet, this body of literature pales in comparison with those on other Yoruba art forms, such as Ifa verses and Ijala and Oriki. Our analysis zooms in on the differences and commonalities between the two versions of Alantere, ultimately arguing that each of these versions is carefully constructed to convey its particular moral through emphases on specific elements of the story and associated song. The observation that African folk tales exist in many variants, none of which can be regarded as the authoritative version, is not new, having appeared in writings as early as 1913, Junot, and 1970, Finnegan. For the Alo tradition specifically, both the existence of a corpus of stories and the variability of the tales, thanks to the inventiveness of the narrators, have been remarked upon by Oluremi Oladele in the quotation on the screen. Our contribution then is to show, through close analysis of two recorded versions of the same story, what such variability may comprise.
Taking the corpus of archived law recordings by Kubik during his 1963 fieldwork as our primary data source, our approach follows historian Annette Hoffman's methodology of close listening, which we have supplemented and expanded by underscoring the importance of collaboration in this kind of research endeavor in a forthcoming article. Collaborative close listening can be summarized as approaching archived materials, pulling different competencies from individual researchers. In our case, we combine our musical analysis competence with experience in ethnographic fieldwork, as well as fluency in German, the language in which Kubik's protocol was written, and Yoruba, the language in which the Alo were told. These different but complementary competencies enabled us to perceive differently and focus on varying aspects of the archived recordings and the narratives in Kubik's documentation. Following from our previous work on two narrations of a story in Kubik's collection by venerated woman storyteller, we were interested in how different versions of stories diverge and in the idea of improvisation in storytelling. We identified Alantere, sometimes called Antere, because Kubik singles it out in his publication on Alo as a story that exists in different versions. We have argued elsewhere that Kubik's archive presents a unique repository for the study of the waning art form of Alo, 8974 and B8975, from his collection. Of course, these are not the only two existing versions of the story of Alantere. We found several others online on online folktale collection, for instance, but today's paper focuses on these two archived recordings specifically. The narrator of B8974 is identified on Kubik's recording protocol as Ahmed Gbadamoshi, 18 years old at the time, an actor in Duro Ladipo's theater in Oshogbo. The narrator of the second version is only identified as an elderly man. In order to explore the structural differences that we observe between the two versions of this story in an analytical way, we mapped them in tabular format, reflected systematically on the similarities and divergences, and in this way drew insights from the alignment of the versions.
The stories in these two versions unfold according to a shared structure, starting with an opening formula, then followed by a section that we identify in both versions as scene 1. This scene provides a contextual character around whom the model at the end of the story ultimately revolves, that is, the parents in B8974 and the child in B8975, is introduced first, as if to signal that the story is primarily about that particular character. In our table, we've drawn attention to the different characters in the story through color-coded highlighting, and you can see how the parents are introduced first in version 1 and the child first in version 2. We may now play the beginning of each narrator's opening. So we're going to have to stop sharing and then reshare, sharing the sound.
Àlọ́ mi lérí fèrè gbàgbó, ó lérí ò lérí, ó lérí bàbá kan àti ìyá kan. Wọ́n bí ọmọ kan. Ní àsìkò ìgbà tí wọ́n bí ọmọ yìí, ìyàn mú púpọ̀ nítorí pé kò sí omi ní ìlú.
Ní ọjọ́ kan, àlọ́ o. Àlọ́ òun lérí fèrè gbàgbó. Ó lérí ọmọ àti ìyá àti bàbá rẹ̀. Ọmọ yìí wà, ó jẹ́ aláìgbọràn. Ọmọ rẹ̀ wá wí fún alóhùn ọ̀gbọ́n, ó wá sọ̀rọ̀ fún ìpè lóhùn ọ̀gbọ́n.
Right, now we can unmute again, share without the sound. Sorry about that. Scene 2 is marked by the parents' instructions to their child, which the latter obeys in B8974 or disobeys in B8975. At this point, the narrations already begin to diverge, with B8974 signaling the parents' consistently harsh treatment of the child, events when they proceed to send the child who has just been rescued from starvation to the river, a disposition that will have later consequences. In B8975, by contrast, the child's disobedience, being consistent with their established behavioral pattern, implies a teleological expectation of an impending consequence from this attitude. Scenes 3 and 4 describe a crisis at the river and constitute the climax of the story. We note that these scenes are highly similar in content between the two versions. In scene 3, the child meets either 3 supernatural beings in B8974 or Oluweri in B8975 at the river and begins to drown. Scene 4 features the arrival of the parent and community members at the river, all of whom are concerned and make efforts to rescue the child. However, the two versions end differently. In B8974, the child drowns, signaling the consequence of the careless parents losing their only child. Conversely, in B8975, the child is rescued after an animal sacrifice is presented as ransom, indicating that the child survives to learn not to continue being disobedient, while the parents, who were not in the wrong, ultimately have the child returned to them, now transformed and ready to obey their instructions. At this point in both versions, the storytellers proceed to state the moral and perform the closing formula. In B8974, the model centers on the importance of parents caring for their children, while it is about children obeying their parents in B8975. We've highlighted this again accordingly. Notably, the climactic scene of the story is punctuated by the song in each case.
The songs in the two versions feature extensive use of quotable material but diverge in areas where each version is unique. The song associated with each version is repeated verbatim when it reoccurs at different times in the narration, signaling that the songs were not improvised by the storytellers, but form part of the quotable materials from their lore repository. In both versions, the song is introduced at the river scene, that is, the highest point in the story, and it occurs twice in the scene. The child begins to sing on sighting a neighbor approaching the river in B8974 and on sighting Oluweri in B8975. And then again when the parents and other community members arrive at the river in both versions. We now play both versions before presenting our observation on their alignment.
Alantere o, alantere o, alantere o, alantere o. Ìyá ní ń pa lédè ń, bàbá ní ń pa lédè ń. Mo múlé mo pa bàrà, mo mọ́ dẹ̀dẹ̀ mo páràn yín. Ìgbà tí mo gbé kété òdodo. Mo dòdò mo bólúwẹ̀rí. Ìkan di tí ìkan yarọ. Ìkan yòókù ṣe tí gbọ̀n. Bẹ̀bà délé o. Kẹ̀kí bàbá mi fún mi. Aláǹtẹ̀rẹ̀ o. Aláǹtẹ̀rẹ̀ o. Bí ó ti kọrin báyìí.
Bàbá bẹ̀rẹ̀ sí kọrin báyìí pé aláǹtẹ̀rẹ̀ o. Aláǹtẹ̀rẹ̀ o. Ìyá ní bomi léwẹ̀ra. Bàbá ní bomi odò wẹ̀ra. Mo bódò mo bolú wẹ̀rí. Ó dàbí ìkórí abẹ. Ó dàbí ìgbẹ̀yìn abẹ. Bẹ́ẹ̀ dédé kẹ́ sọ fún ìyá mi. Kó má ṣe síwájú ogun. Kó má sì sí gbẹ̀yìn ogun. Aláǹtẹ̀rẹ̀ o. Aláǹtẹ̀rẹ̀ o.
So
I can carry on.
now, yeah, let me share the.
Okay. Both songs begin with a call and response introduction to the song, where Gbadamosi includes an extra set of repetitions that are melodically embellished. Gbadamosi's version, that is B8974, continues with a section describing the harsh conditions or instructions for polishing the house that the parents had given the child, and a section where the child relates having followed the instructions. The elderly man's version, B8975, omits the text and instead adds a section relating to the instruction the parents gave the child about bathing. There is a slight discrepancy between the elderly man's song text and his narration, where the mother and the father are said in the song to have given opposing instruction. Mother warned me to bathe with water from the house. Father asked me to bathe with water from the river. Following these sections, the crisis at the river is portrayed in the song, and we note that the two versions converge exactly at this point. When I get to the river, I met Oluweri. So while in Gbadamosi's telling and also in his song, the child met three other worldly beings, his song additionally reveals that these beings represent Oluweri, the river deity. The elderly man's version expands the danger that this meeting holds for the child in metaphorical terms, referring to the sharp side of a knife, Odabi Koriabe. The penultimate section of the song relates the child's parting messages to the parents. The presence of this section in both versions represents another point of tension between the elderly man's narration, where it seems to us that the child was rescued thanks to the sacrifice made to the deity by the parents and the community members, and his song indicating that the child passed away. Interestingly, the child's parting words in the elderly man's version expresses particular regard to the mother, who in the song had warned the child not to go to the river. Melodically, Badamasi seems to underscore the section with the child's parting words at the river as the final section. He does this by introducing a hitherto unheard tone of the pentatonic scale, namely the highest tone, the submediant, at the line, "When you get home, inform my mother." And he ends the line, "Bid farewell to my father for me," on the tonic, unlike the other call and response, which had all ended on the supertonic. By contrast, the elderly man's version does not contain these form-reinforcing melodic changes. Both songs end with a closing set of call and response exchanges that mirror the introduction in reiterating the name of the song and the story.
In connecting our insights to Barbara's notion of intextualization, the first point to be made is that Alantere, as with other stories, features recontextualized quotations from an established corpus of text. For Barbara, the practice of quotation is an essential and revealing feature of intextualization, which she explains as hanging together with obscurity and exegesis. In her example, she focuses particularly on the way in which epithets in Oriki function as both the trigger and the punchline of a story. The epithet encapsulates the idea of the story and can be used as a shorthand for recalling it. This is what Barbara means by obscurity, which she suggests is a hallmark of many African oral literary genres. The complement of this obscurity is exegesis, that is, the need for the epithet to be explained by means of the story it evokes. For Barbara, this contemplative and dialogic activity of engaging with the established oral text is another deep-seated characteristic of African oral literature. Our suggestion is that quotation, obscurity, and exegesis are also present in the practice of Alo storytelling, where, however, it is not epithets that function as the quotable, detachable, recontextualized part of the discourse, but rather motives from the call and response song, as well as motives of content from the story. For instance, the two versions combine the elements of the storyline in two distinct ways in order to build up to the diverging emphases of the morals. In this way, the constitutive elements of the plot are treated as pliable. In Barbara's terminology, they can be detached and recontextualized. The way they make up the story, influence the song content, and lead up to the model is not fixed but adaptable. They can coalesce into different versions, each with its own structural coherence. However, the fact of their recombination and the fundamental fluidity of the different versions also leave traces in the moments of tension we have observed, especially between the narrations and the songs. And wrapping up now, furthermore, the call, Alanterio, and the response, Alanterio, have in fact been recontextualized in popular music as seen in songs with the same title by the artists on the screen. By itself, the call and response snippet of the song is, in Barbara's terms, a quotation which is obscure, yet it can, for the initiated, conjure up the full song and story, and in that way receive the exegesis that it needs to acquire its full meaning. Consequently, we suggest that Alo storytelling requires and inculcates a unique instantiation of the cognitive work of reflection and interpretation that Barbara describes as central to African oral literature. Therefore, the accessibility of Alo does not, in our view, detract from its sophistication at all. Rather, the way in which it puts the practices of intextualization into operation marks it as equally worthy of aesthetic appreciation as the poetry of Oriki. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We started this session about some 7 minutes late. So actually, we have just 6 minutes for question and answer. There's one on Zoom. We'll take that first, then we'll take any other question in the room in Lagos. So there's a question here that your title assumes that our law is aesthetically complex. I would like to know the objective criteria used to establish the complexity. That's the question on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So our reference to complexity is based off our literature review, and particularly we reviewed literature on African oral traditions, and we observed that Oriki, Ijala, and Eseifa in particular have been presented in literature as aesthetically complex. And the argument we made was that if you peel back layers of our law, you would realize that our law is equally as sophisticated, but that has not been acknowledged in literature.
Thank you. Are there questions in the room in Lagos? We'll still have about 5 minutes. I'm making sure we get the full 30 minutes for this presentation. Okay, please go on.
Thank you very much. I'm Adeola Fale. I like the concept presented, and I want to congratulate the paper presenters that they have done well with their literature review. However, the aesthetic values based on the sample of the folk song, a particular folktale sample they use, is what I have queries with. There is no aesthetic complexities at all in that particular example cited. The only thing I enjoyed and where I will align with them is that Alantere particularly will be rendered by any member of Yoruba community based on their exposure, the version of the story that they can recite. The first example, like Alantere o antere, iyani mo mirodo, babani mbomile sora, mobodo mobolu weri, okan sheti gboin, okan suke okan yaro. And there's another version which also deviates from that. And like Ilesomi quite cited, that you will find versions, variations of this law and the content, but the thematic relevance is the major theme that you cannot run away from. Does the folktale particularly communicate similar message, either with variations or with versions, either from Ijesha, from Igbomin Oasis, or from Lagos? So if there is variant, or if there are variants of text, but that communicates similar message, then there's no complexity, my view. Thank you.
Please respond.
Thank you very much for that comment. Well, what actually struck us when we started to look into the differences between the versions was the fact that they have different models. So these two versions actually build up to different models. And so when we started looking into the examples, we had actually assumed that it was going to be about maybe elaborating a bit here, elaborating a bit there, and that the differences were going to be sort of in the performance elements. But when we discovered that these two versions actually had opposite models, we realized that there's maybe some more depth to this, and where the aesthetic complexity also struck us quite a bit was in the way that the processes of intellectualization can be observed here. So the same processes of intellectualization that have been observed for Uriki, for instance, this idea that there is chunks of discourse and they can be recombined, and that this has been demonstrated so beautifully for Uriki, but it has not been demonstrated for Alo, and that is also where we feel that we are right to say that there is aesthetic complexity there. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to overflog the issue of complexity. Just to say that one way to engage with that is that the audience for Alo is different from that of SFA, Esha, usually those ones exist in the world of adults. So there are, Karen Baba, I don't think she did much work on Alo. She was Uriki and so on and so forth. So those are very complex. This one is the simplest thing because the audience is actually dominated by children. I sang this particular one, growing up with my father. So you can't be too complex with the word of children. This is without prejudice. to the excellent job that you did in comparing these examples, but the complexity thing would not apply to the Alo tradition. Thank you.
All right, we're right on time. We'll move on to the next presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Wium and Dr. Kunnuji.